Hello, students, and welcome as we begin a brand new chapter exploring the time between the two world wars, World War I and World War II. You'll see in this chapter that we're going to be hitting on a few different regions and a few specific topics that really bridge this gap of history. I'm particularly focusing on the generation of people who lives between these two conflicts, the so-called lost generation that we talked about earlier. But we're going to start our exploration by talking about Russia. And you'll see that some of this content is going to be overlapping with what we covered previously in World War I. We already explored the exit of Russia from the Great War, the uprising of the Bolsheviks, collapse of the Tsarist state. This will make that story a little bit more clear. So please title your notes for today, Instability in Russia. Heading forward in our course, you're going to see the United States develop as the superpower that we know it to be today, and its greatest adversary, or the other strongest power in the world, will eventually become the Soviet Union. So this will lay the foundation for really how it becomes the USSR. So it's important to take a look a little bit back in history. We talked about some of the other czars throughout Russia's past, and one notable one was Tsar Alexander III. He was largely following in the footsteps of Peter the Great, trying to very, very quickly industrialize Russia, catch them up with the rest of the world. And like a lot of other Russians, he blamed wealthy Jewish merchants for the poor economy in Russia. And it prompts a series of what have been called pogroms. And these are kind of like campaigns to eradicate Jewish people who are living within Russia. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is not to, show grotesque imagery or, talk about something that's very upsetting, but rather it really is a precursor for the type of anti-Semitism that is present in Europe during this time and what the Nazi regime is going to capitalize on in Germany in only a few years. So one other important thing to note as part of these pogroms, because they were being carried out in Russia, many Jewish people fled from Russia into regions like Poland and Czechoslovakia, and these will be the sites where ultimately many people will be rounded up and executed as part of the Holocaust. And here you're seeing an image from 1904. This is a woman looking on the corpses of many Jewish people outside of a Jewish hospital. All right, so we're going to start off by talking about Tsar Nicholas II, who was the ruler of Russia, of course, during the Great War. We spoke about him a bit previously. And what's important to know about Tsar Nicholas II is he ends up being wed to a German princess. It's the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And Tsar Alexander, who we spoke about previously, and Queen Victoria are very hesitant about the marriage at first. But then suddenly Tsar Alexander falls ill. He knows that his son has to find a bride to keep the succession going. And after the wedding, this princess takes the name Alexandra to be more Russian. And together they have 4 daughters and 1 son, securing the lineage of the czars. Of course, the male child will become the next in line. So this is a famous portrait of Tsar Nicholas II, the final czar of Russia. And here we have the Tsarina Alexandra. This is their family, again, with the 4 daughters and the 1 son. You're probably familiar with the one daughter, Anastasia, who, of course, is the subject of the film, the animated film, as well as the Broadway play about her life. That play is largely fabricated. In reality, she did not live past the Russian Revolution. That play kind of centers on the myth that she somehow survived and she's located years later. So again, to understand the full collapse of Russia, the emergence of the Bolsheviks, and the rest of the story, we have to look at the full picture and the full history. And this is what, honors and AP are really all about. It's about synthesizing these different topics together. So between 1904 and 1905, the Russo-Japanese War was a conflict that took place between the Japanese as well as the Russians over a pocket of land called Manchuria. Think of the age of imperialism, these countries competing for different territories, and they're both hoping that it's going to make them stronger countries, to win public support, more resources. Keep in mind, this is very close to mainland Japan. It is very far from the central hub of Russia. And ultimately, the Japanese are extremely superior to the Russians in their battles. They win every single one of them, and the Russians are totally humiliated. Here you can see this is the pocket of land that's really being disputed, Manchuria. This is going to be extremely relevant as we head into World War II. During the Boxer Rebellion, both the Russians and the Japanese contributed to the 8-member force that was sent to put down the uprising in China. But when that was happening, the Russians left 177,000 troops near their own railroad projects in Manchuria, and this kind of becomes the site where this showdown takes place. This is a satirical map of Europe and Asia. You can see how the Russians are portrayed as like this octopus with its tentacles reaching out around. And of course, the one tentacle is reaching out into Manchuria. One thing that's important that I want you to take note of, just because you're going to be taking U.S. history in the future, is that it's actually the Americans who become the facilitators of peace here. It's Teddy Roosevelt who is going to actually orchestrate the signing of this treaty at the end of the Russo-Japanese War. And in terms of big picture significance, the Japanese really become a world power here, and the Russians are seen by the world as being on the border of being unstable. So going into this era of the Great Wars, now we have the Japanese as this notable powerhouse, and we have Russia kind of showing signs of cracks and weaknesses, lending itself to a communist uprising, which we'll see here. There are also internal problems inside of Russia as well. In terms of grievances, workers are extremely overworked. Their lives are largely miserable. 11-hour workdays, extremely dangerous factory conditions. We talked about this in the Industrial Revolution. And in 1903, Gregory Gaban is like this union head, one of the only union heads in all of Russia. And he's funded by the Japanese to basically cause the stir in Russia, to cause unrest. If you know anything about history, labor unions tend to clash with big business and oftentimes government. And that's exactly what happens here in the event that's been known as Bloody Sunday. So union members are fired for rallying together and fighting for better working conditions. Massive strikes break out all around St. Petersburg. Gapan marches on the Tsar's Winter Palace. And they don't want anything that's really that crazy. They want higher wages. They want an 8-hour workday. And of course, they want an end to the Russo-Japanese War, which they see is draining the Russian economy and forcing young men to fight wars and ultimately lose their lives. So when they show up at the Tsar's Winter Palace, the Tsar is actually not there, but the guards fire on the protesters, and 100 of these union workers, these protesters, are killed. The Tsar is largely blamed for this, even though he's not at the palace. And what ensues afterward is what's been called the 1905 Revolution. This is not the Russian Revolution. This is where things get a little bit confusing. But this is like a series of uprisings beforehand. So here you're seeing, for example, a train being toppled by these Russian workers and outrage after Bloody Sunday. And we start seeing student walkouts. We start seeing worker riots and basically extreme unrest throughout all of Russia. Here you're seeing a civilian protest in 1905, fighting for working conditions and more representation in government. The Tsar does not want to abdicate his power. He has come from a line of absolute monarchs. He is resistant to creating anything that will give the common people a say in government, but he yields because of this unrest and creates what's called the State Duma. This is basically a parliament that gives common people a voice. So it's like a lower house of government that's supposed to represent normal citizens. But the Duma has a lot of problems inherently with it. So it's an illusion of representation. The Duma cannot pass any law without the Tsar's approval. And the Tsar can also issue vetoes, overrule any of their votes. He can dismiss the Duma and hold new elections to change the members at any time. And he can pass what have been called emergency laws without the Duma, basically go around them. So the Duma really has no actual authority, no actual power. And Russia is largely going to remain an absolute monarchy going into World War I. So transitioning to a secondary topic that's also very relevant to the story is the story of Alexei Romanov. He, of course, is the only male child of Tsar Nicholas II. He is the heir to the Russian throne, but he's quite ill. He suffers from a disease called hemophilia, which basically results in blood or like a person bleeding profusely. If they are cut or wounded, they tend to be very sickly. It is important to note that many of these monarchs did have a large amount of interbreeding between them, cousins marrying cousins, family members marrying each other, and illnesses in these royal bloodlines was quite common. So the question for you is, why would the Tsar and the Tsarina want to keep Alexei's illness a secret from the general public? And the answer might be obvious, because he is the male heir to the throne, and think of the instability it would cause in Russia if people knew the truth about his ailment. So the Tsar and the Tsarina are desperate to heal their son. They end up becoming quite close with the so-called Mad Monk, a man named Grigory Rasputin. He is a mystic. He is summoned by the Tsarina after basically meeting him on the part of some of the royal members of the court. The heir to the throne is expected to die. But then all of a sudden, when Rasputin starts spending time with Alexei, he starts to improve. And there are a lot of theories about why this is the case. Some people have theorized it's hypnosis. Many people have argued that Rasputin basically told the doctors to stop giving the child medication, and aspirin was very commonly used for almost all illnesses during this time, and aspirin tends to make people bleed more as a blood thinner. So some people think this may be the reason why he was feeling better. And also, Rasputin was like playing with the boy. He was like entertaining, and the reduction of stress may have also contributed to it too. But the Tsar and the Tsarina are amazed, and it forges this very strong bond between them. Tsar Nicholas refers to Rasputin as one of his holy friends and makes him a leading member on the royal court. Rasputin calls the Tsar and the Tsarina Papa and Mama. It's a bizarre relationship, but he becomes a very powerful figure in Russia during this time. And the Tsarina literally comes to believe that God is speaking to her through Rasputin. So people largely did not like the Tsarina because she was German, and they viewed her as a spy, especially during World War I. And Rasputin was hated by the nobility. They saw him as a kook. They saw him as like too powerful and having too much influence over Tsar Nicholas. And ultimately, that's going to lead to his demise. So Rasputin claims that he has a vision that Russia will only succeed if Tsar Nicholas II personally goes and leads the troops during World War I. Tsar Nicholas II has no military experience. This only hurts them on the Eastern Front. And meanwhile, it's the Tsarina and Rasputin leading the government, and nobles hated Rasputin. So the entire governmental structure at home in Russia is very unstable and starts to fall apart. Here you can see this is Rasputin and the royal family during World War I. Notice the Tsar is notably absent here. So the death of Rasputin has been something that has taken on almost like a mythical nature over time. Stories of his demise have been probably fabricated, but remain interesting to this day. Rumors were swirling that Rasputin was sleeping with the Tsarina as well as many other women of high status in Russia. This very well may have been true. Nobles came together to plot his assassination, seeing it as the only way to basically get rid of his hold over the Tsar. And they invite him to one of their palaces one night to talk. It's there that he's executed. This is the assassin, Felix Yusupov. He is the one who really plans this out. And you can see here, this is the basement where the murder takes place. It is important to note that Yusupov's account of what happens is really what we've used historically to understand his death. But he may have fabricated the details to make himself more exciting, to make more of a name for himself. And Rasputin's own daughter disputes many of the points that are raised in Yusupov's accounts. So this history is largely disputed, but according to Yusupov, the men attempt to poison Rasputin with arsenic. They give him cakes that are laced with poison. He doesn't die. They lace his drinks with poison. He doesn't die. And the men are flabbergasted, again, according to this account. Ultimately, they shoot him. That doesn't kill him. He gets up and tries to run away, and the men ultimately bludgeon him to death and then throw him into a river where he ultimately drowns. Again, the details surrounding this are very varied. It's not entirely clear exactly what happened that day, and we probably will never know the details. But the significance of Rasputin remains in terms of really setting the stage for how unstable Russia is going into World War I.